Ready? All right, everyone. Good morning. Shh. Good morning and welcome back. We're glad to get started this morning talking about negotiation in drug markets, and Pamela Barwick is going to be presenting for us.
Thank you. Thank you for including our paper on the program. Tianli, who is on the Zoom, is stuck in China, so I'm presenting the paper, but he will help me with a Q&A session. So over the past couple of decades, we have made great strides in inventing innovative drugs. So now with the proliferation of biological products and genetic therapies, in addition to traditional chemical drugs. However, those drugs are incredibly expensive. An example here is Verzenio, a breast cancer drug that can improve 5-year survival rate by 12%. It costs $180K per annual dose in the US, and also is very expensive in China. If you look at, this is not just unique to particular drugs, a disease category. If you look at all of the drugs covered by the Medicare Part D out of the 3,500 drugs, the top 50 drugs, about 1%, accounts for about 50% of Medicare Part B spending. So insurance, particularly government subsidized insurance, can improve affordability, but it poses heavy strain on government spending. This is not unique to the US. It's also prevalent in other countries. So making the innovative drugs affordable is a global challenge. Other solutions include administrative prices, but without market signals, it's hard to get prices right. You could also do auctions that are not applicable here because those drugs are essentially owned by are protected by patents. Another solution is negotiation. Despite the fact that negotiation is widely used across countries under different formats, for example, in France first negotiated prices for innovative drugs in 1997, followed by Italy in 2004, Canada in 2010, Germany in 2011. There are few studies that look at the welfare implications and distributional implications of those negotiations, as well as what kind of design works best. Okay. So this is where this paper steps in. We study a ongoing large profile and high profile reform, healthcare reform, arguably the largest, the most important reform in China, going back a couple of decades, called National Reimbursement Drug List Reform that started in 2016. A key feature of this reform is it couples the centralized negotiation with drug insurance expansion, hence the title of the paper, A Double Dose of Reform. So those are the two government instruments that are employed hand in hand in this reform. There are several nice features of the Chinese market that makes the study easier. First, it is universal insurance. It covers the entire population, so we don't have to model the participation decision. And second, this is a rolled out reform that started with a handful of drugs in 2016 and gradually rolled out to a wider set of disease categories and more drugs. So we observe the outcomes both before and after the reform, both for covered drugs and for drugs that are not covered or not yet covered. And a third nice feature of this reform is we do observe failed negotiations, which are pretty rare for a lot of empirical studies on bargainings. So here we not only observe the drugs that are eventually included in the national formulary, we also observe drugs that failed in negotiations. So the differences in the negotiated outcomes give us a unique opportunity to examine government objectives. And lastly, while the central government essentially institutes a level of co-insurance rate, some wealthy regions steps in and subsidizes more. So we have de facto a regressive co-insurance design in practice, and this motivates us to think about alternative co-insurance design that perhaps would be more desirable, okay? So the research question of this paper is pretty straightforward. We have two simple goals. The first is to do a program evaluation to look at what happens to prices, quantities, welfare, and survival. And the second part is more toward thinking about program or policy design. So we have three sets of different counterfactuals that try to mimic practices we observe around the world. So we're going to first look at the differences between what we call market access versus formulary access. It will become clear later, that tries to mimic the practice in Canada or Europe. Second is centralized versus decentralized negotiations that try to mimic the practice in Europe or US. And lastly is motivated by the observation that in some countries the insurance premium is or the insurance design is income-based. So here we're going to look at alternative co-insurance designs that might be more favorable. In all three sets of counterfactuals, we're going to observe trade-offs. There will be trade-offs between the extensive margin, a wider coverage of drugs, versus intensive margin, lower or higher prices. We're going to observe trade-offs, geographical trade-offs, winners and losers in different parts of the country when we do decentralized versus centralized bargaining, or equity versus efficiency when we think about income-based coinsurance. And that will become clear later. I will try to draw a conclusion about what we think characterizes perhaps a desirable policy design. So just to give you some institutional background, like many European countries, China has universal healthcare system. And the enrollment is very high. More than 95% of the population is covered by the national health insurance system. The premium is quite low. There are two different plans, but by and large, the premium is $50. Designed to not be a barrier. There is commercial insurance. In our sample period, it covered less than 7% of the population. It is growing, so in the future years, commercial insurance could be more important. The key feature that we analyze, a key feature that characterizes this reform, is the fact that prior to 2016, the national formulary did not cover innovative drugs, only covered generic drugs for budgetary considerations. This is a 2018 comic drama movie that was a blockbuster that was based on the title Dying to Survive, that's based on a true story of a leukemia patient who smuggled drugs from India in order to cure himself and his friends and relatives. And driven by the public demand for coverage of more innovative drugs, China started this reform. So in 2016, the government essentially did a pilot trial that invited 5 drugs, the producers of those 5 drugs, to a negotiation table and combined. So if the negotiation is successful, if the firms are willing to give the government a sizable price discount, then the drug will be included in a national formulary. And so that's what we call the combined policy tools, insurance expansion together with a central negotiation. Over the years, the negotiation has expanded to more than 250 disease categories and covering, so by 2022, 480 drugs, and by now about 600 drugs. So you can see this gradual expansion of the negotiation going through different disease categories. And the negotiation happens one day a year prior to that negotiation day, there's a lot of information exchange between the government and the farm producers about, price, quantity, and reimbursement, etc. And on that day, there will be independent negotiations happening at the same time in closed-door rooms. The government sends 2 delegates, one expert on healthcare issues, the other is financial expert, and the farm, sends their delegates. So we're going to treat this. This is a classic example of independent, simultaneous negotiation. And so you can see that the overall success rate is about 3/4. So some drugs do fail negotiation. And then when you talk about when the government explains why some negotiations succeed and others fail, the budgetary consideration is front and center. They often say the drug is simply too expensive to be covered by the national formulary. And so our data comes from Sino Health that covers very detailed price, quantity information at the SKU level. We aggregate them to brand, province, quarter level, because this is our level of observation. And our data comes from 2017 first quarter, which is essentially the beginning of the reform, to 2023 second quarter. For today's presentation, I'm just going to focus on cancer drugs. This is a very important disease category. It accounts for, the sales is about 0.1% of GDP and accounts for 60% of the reform program revenue. So it's a big class. It also matters. Millions of lives are at stake. China accounts for 23% of global incidence, global cancer incidence, and 30% of global death mortality. And so during our sample period, there are 89 negotiations with 70 cancer drugs, and eventually 57 of them were successful. So this is essentially the focus of our analysis in this paper. To give you some descriptive evidence, there are 2 figures. The first one is simply sales of cancer drugs, by 4 broad categories. There are 4 categories. The first is what we call, denoted by the blue line, is what we call the innovative drugs. Those are monoclonal antibodies and protein kinase inhibitors. As you can see, their sales expanded dramatically over our sample period, from around 10 billion RMB to more than 60 billion RMB per year by 2022. The dashed red line is the traditional chemotherapy. The innovative drugs are much more targeted. They have a much more precise targets and hence have less side effects than traditional chemotherapy. And the other 2, the green line is the hormone therapy, and then the yellow ones are others, including traditional Chinese herbal treatment. The second, the figure on the right, zooms in at the innovative cancer drugs and plot the sales separately for sales under insurance versus sales that are out of pocket. As you can see, in 2017, most of the sales are driven by out-of-pocket purchases. Only a slight fraction that's primarily driven by Shanghai and Beijing that also cover a very selective set of cancer drugs. By 2010-22, as you can see, almost all of the expansion in sales came from expenditure of covered, essentially drugs that are covered, that are included in the national formulary. The reform has had a massive impact on both drug prices and drug revenue. So we look at, regardless how you do this, whether you use two-way fixed effects, you use the Callaway-Santana, and many other, 5 or 6 different event studies, the figures look strikingly similar, that there's a massive price reduction. So this is quarterly data. 0.0 is the quarter when the negotiation finishes. Okay, so if we compare the prices of drugs that are successfully negotiated versus those that failed or not yet negotiated, there's on average a 57% reduction in price post the negotiation. And that's immediate. They essentially rolled out the drugs are already sold in the hospital systems. Now the price sticker just dropped instantaneously. Demand also picked up, but there are 2-quarter lag, and there's the out-of-pocket price dropped by 86% because the retail price dropped and the insurance kicks in, and the quantity increased by 930%. Massive expansion, okay? In our structural analysis, we can reproduce almost exactly, very closely, the price drop and the quantity expansion. And so in the model has 2 stages. It's a static model. In the first stage, the farms who are not eligible for negotiation, each year the government lists a set of drugs that are eligible for negotiation. If you look at the list, it has pretty clear eligibility requirements. The drug has to be developed or patented within the past 5 years. Some orphan drugs are also included, and are essentially targeting disease categories that are very popular. There's a big public demand. And for the other drugs that are not eligible for negotiation, those farms simply set along, Bertrand Nash. So they choose their prices for different provinces and sell, to maximize their profit. For drugs that are eligible for negotiation, they will negotiate with the government given the demand preferences, given the marginal cost, and also given TOL, which is farms' negotiation power, and beta, government's preference, for government's preference, then they can reach agreement. Some succeed and some fail. After that, consumers basically choose demand. I'm not going to talk about demand at all. It's pretty straightforward, nicely loaded, with income, heterogeneous consumer income attributes, drug year fixed, province year fixed effects, except we do incorporate combination therapies. And the way we identify preference for combination therapies is look at sales bump of those drugs after the FDA or the Chinese equivalent NHSA's approval of clinical therapy. Okay, we don't observe the therapy level sales, but we approve drug level sales. Okay, so let's maybe focus on supply side. We're going to essentially recover model primitives that can rationalize negotiation outcomes. First is success or failure. Second is a price. So I already mentioned that farms aren't eligible. They just do Bertrand Nash pricing. And because we observe the price and quantities prior to the reform, we're going to use those data to recover the marginal cost for each of the drug. That's very important because we no longer need to use the negotiation outcomes to recover both marginal cost and bargaining parameters. Okay, bargaining parameters are essentially entirely separately identified. And so the Nash protocol is different from a typical setting in that when the negotiation fails, the drug can still be sold in the private market. It's just not included in the national formulary. In a more typical setting, the drug will be excluded from consumer's choice set altogether, which is what we're going to evaluate later. So the firm's objective is quite simple. With a successful negotiation, their profit is simply markup per unit of sales times total quantity. If the negotiation fails, then their profit is simply from Bertrand Nash is a sum of their profit in each province where they can set the prices, flexibly, except that the drug is not in the national formulary, so it doesn't have the insurance subsidy. The gains from trade for the farms is simply the difference between the two. For the government, as I mentioned, the government's quite clear. They care about consumer welfare. They also care about financial constraints. So we're going to model their objective as the consumer surplus minus beta times the government spending, where beta captures the government's preference for government spending relative to consumer welfare. Then gains from trade for the government is changes in those two terms when the drug is included versus not included. And so a key element that we need to, a key feature that we need to confront is the fact negotiations do fail. So here, It means that there has to be a set of admissible prices where both sides have non-negative gains from trade, since there's no lump sum transfers, in order for the negotiation to succeed. Otherwise, the negotiations would fail. And if the negotiation succeeds, prices are simply determined to maximize the net product, which is pretty standard. So the first order condition here, is very similar to the oligopoly pricing, except patients pay out of pocket, not the retail price. There's an insurance expansion, and the government has bargaining power, which then essentially exerts downward pressure on prices. So to illustrate the intuition of identification as well as the counterfactual results, I'm going to go through this graph, pretty simple, but slowly, that this is the red line characterizes the firm's gains from trade at every possible price, because we have already figured out demand and marginal cost. So this is known prior to the negotiation. And the government, the gains from trade, is the blue line. If we knew beta, then this is also known, because it's simply the difference between consumer surplus or consumer welfare measured by survival minus spending, okay? So as you can see in the example here, there's an admissible set where the negotiation will succeed. In addition, we can also pin down on this graph the range, the lower bound and the upper bound that corresponds to tau equal to 0. If the government has all the bargaining power, firms has none, price would be at the P lower level, and vice versa. So by observing what the observed prices, how do the observed prices compare to this range, we can essentially learn about tau, which side has a higher bargaining parameter. And now coming back to the government preference beta, this is essentially from those two terms, we know the highest beta that can essentially sustain a successful negotiation. So now we're going to impose a parametric distribution on beta. So beta is random, different across different negotiations, to use MOE to recover both the distribution of beta and tau. In terms of the results, the demand elasticity is pretty sensible to the literature. The beta, the median is about 1.09, so roughly equal weight on consumer surplus versus spending. But notably, we also have a specification that allows beta to depend on overall survival. If overall survival increases by 1 standard deviation, then this significantly relaxes government budget constraint, makes the negotiation more likely to succeed. And tau is 0.66, so the farms have more bargaining power relative to the government in our context. So now let's move on. I only have 2 minutes. Oh, okay. So, sorry, I practiced many times, but I'm still slower. Okay, so we're going to focus on counterfactuals. First, just program evaluation, look at the drugs that succeeded. And the first line is a baseline. You can see that the retail price is very high, 200,000 RMB per year. Nothing changes for the out-of-pocket, for the baseline, and then only 3% of the cancer market shares go to innovative drugs. The second line is negotiation only. Nothing changes since the government is not providing any carrots to the farm. The third line is expansion only, mimic, the expansion in the US and other countries. The retail prices don't change much because on one hand, insurance makes the demand more elastic, puts price higher, but on the other hand, you are attracting more elastic consumers. So not a big change on the retail price, but a big change in out-of-pocket because insurance kicks in. And that leads to a threefold increase in demand. The last row is expansion plus negotiation. The retail price had a 60% reduction. On top of that, the insurance leads to a 90% reduction in out-of-pocket and 10-fold increase in, 9 to 10-fold increase in spend in quantity. There's a big boost to overall survival. The average overall survival per patient, cancer patient, is 6 months for wealthy people in wealthy region and 2 months for poor people in poor region. And big changes in consumer surplus and 1.1 million lives saved each year. Okay. Policy simulations. The first is what we call market access negotiation. So in the current reform, it's formulary access negotiation. If this negotiation succeeds, you have access to the national formulary. But in many other countries, if the negotiation succeeds, you have access to the market. If the negotiation fails, you actually are excluded from the market. And so we look at what happens. So this is the original graph you have seen that characterizes, gains from trade under the current reform. Under the market access negotiation, the punishment is more severe for both sides. The farm is going to lose the entire market. The government patients are going to lose because they essentially have no access to the innovative drug. So that severe punishment expands the gains from trade for both sides. As a result, immediately you're going to have more drugs to be covered. That's extensive margin, but the price is unclear. If the government has all the bargaining power, the price will push from the lower end to the marginal cost. So this is a win-win situation. On the other hand, if the farms have all the bargaining power, you have a big expansion in coverage, but the price will be higher. So there's an extensive, intensive trade-off. So in this case here, what we found is, okay, I will stop in 30 seconds, that in our setting, the extensive margin dominates. So market access is better than formulary access. And then we have also looked at decentralized and centralized. Again, this is essentially, as you can see, a weighted average of poor regions versus wealthy regions. While on average, centralized negotiations leads to more coverage and lower prices, there are geographic losers and winners. In particular, wealthier regions would prefer to negotiate individually because they can get a wider coverage and higher patient welfare. And lastly, income-based coinsurance, the generous, 30 seconds, more generous insurance has both pros and cons. So more generous insurance is better for consumers, but it has higher. So then the farms, because they have more profit to gain, they're willing to give a bigger price discount. Okay. On the other hand, generous insurance is heavier strain on government budget. So the negotiation is more likely to fail. So again, you can see this clear trade-off between the intensive and extensive margin. If you look at the progressive versus regressive insurance, there's a spillover from one group to the other. In particular, what we have found, this is basically showing what I just shown, that the top level is the most generous insurance. You have more failures, but cheaper prices. There's what we found at the optimal is actually a slightly regressive co-insurance design is more desirable because the more demand from wealthier patients will lead to a wider coverage and lower price that's better for the poor group as well. Okay, you can see this spillover essentially leads to our conclusion that a slightly regressive co-insurance design can be desirable socially. So let me just conclude that this is a major, highlight reform that led to big gains in consumer surplus, saved 1 million life years per year. And we look at different insurance design, and we recommend the market access negotiation plus insurance expansion that achieves 29% increase of social surplus, 29% relative to the status quo, and achieves 93% of first best. Thank you. Sorry, I'm running out of time.
Thank you very much, Panla. Our discussion will be Ashwin Gandhi. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to discuss this really excellent paper, which is already R&R at the AER. So I am not going to be reviewer number 6. Instead, I'm only going to make one substantive comment, which is you kind of have this neat variation of the staggered rollout of these negotiations. It would be kind of cool to see whether when they fail a negotiation with one particular drug, if in the next year or the year afterwards, they seem to be trying to negotiate with a really good replacement for that drug. It would tell us whether or not these stories about threats of replacement maybe are real here. I know they're not in the model, but this is a rare setting where we might actually be able to tell something about this. Okay, setting that aside, I'm just going to use the other 9 minutes to just re-advertise the paper and its approach. So you already saw this example of this drug Verzenio. Pharmaceuticals are pretty amazing. If you take it twice a day and you happen to have advanced breast cancer, it moves you from this orange survival curve to the blue survival curve, which is pretty awesome. And people are naturally willing to pay quite a lot for that. In the US, you'd spend about $180,000 a year, or not you, your insurance company would. And we've paid a lot of attention to how to bring that $180,000 a year number down. But in a lot of lower income countries, they don't really have insured access to these drugs. And so even at a really low price, like $10,000 a year, in China, almost nobody was using these drugs. And so they study this really, really interesting and really important reform in China where the government starts in a staggered way negotiating with a bunch of new innovative drugs where they agree to give formulary coverage to those drugs if those pharmaceutical companies agree to a much lower price. And so it, in fact, does seem to work in bringing prices down substantially, and you get huge increases in utilization of those drugs, such that you end up in just from cancer drugs, they find something like 1.1 million additional life years saved each year. So probably the single biggest healthcare intervention I've seen in a paper ever. And I think that that fact is sort of understated in the paper, but it's something that we should all really appreciate. And the authors take this as an opportunity to estimate, I think, a really compelling model of the negotiations that are happening under the reform. I'm going to try to reiterate that model because I know it can be sometimes hard to follow in equations. I'm going to just try to do it really quickly again in pictures. We're all familiar with standard Econ 101, how pricing happens. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. If there's no insurance here, no bargaining, you have your consumer surplus, producer surplus. When we have bargaining where the government can say whether or not you're allowed to participate in the market, it ends up pushing down the price because now you're maximizing some convex combination of log consumer surplus and log producer surplus. But in this setting, they kind of have a little bit of an interesting feature, which is that their disagreement payoff here is that the firm can go back to selling to uninsured people at the profit maximizing price. And so the government actually has to do something to induce the firm to even participate in the negotiations at all, which is a little bit unusual in the bargaining literature. And so the key thing they introduce that allows for there to be any actual gains from trade from the side of the firm is that the government is agreeing to provide insurance coverage for that drug if the company agrees to a lower price. And so what does insurance coverage mean here? Well, the consumer doesn't actually pay the negotiated price, the PB here. They pay gamma times that, where gamma is some small number. And so the consumers purchase as if they're on this, as if the price is much lower. So in essence, it shifts out the purchasing demand curve. Now, what that means is that you've really widened the amount of producer surplus that you can give the firm. And so as long as you're providing above some lower P-bar level of price, the firm has some gains from trade and is willing to come to the table and negotiate. The other thing that offering insurance does is it really increases the amount of consumer surplus, but that's not free. The government actually has to pay for those drugs. They pay everything between the consumer out of pocket and what the negotiated price is. And whether the government's objective function here needs to trade off between that additional consumer surplus they're getting consumers from bargaining this price and the cost they have to endure because they're providing this insurance coverage. And so one of the cool things that they do in this paper is they estimate the government's trade-off between how much they value consumer surplus, and then how much the government values its own spending in G. And that parameter they're going to be estimating here is this beta. Okay, so as long as the price is above that floor and below some maximum level the government is willing to pay, given how much the government cares about government expenditure, that's the sort of potential feasible set for negotiations. Now, the more the government cares about its expenditure, the lower that upper limit is. And in fact, if the government cares a lot about its expenditure, you actually may not have any feasible set for negotiations. Now, normally we think about the possibility of bargaining breakdowns, and we just say, let's just pretend they don't exist for the purposes of our modeling. Here, actually, it's going to be a feature and not a bug because they're going to use the fact that they have some negotiations that don't end up succeeding in order to identify this parameter beta that tells us about the government's objective function. Okay, so how do they actually do all of this in practice? Well, estimating demand, they do in a very reasonable way that probably all of us would like and agree with. It's a really rich demand model, probably one of the most rich I've seen in a pharmaceutical paper. I won't go into the details aside from one kind of cool thing that they do, which is they actually use the policy intervention as a source of variation to help them identify price elasticities. And by that, I mean they observe the kind of before and the after prices. And what they argue very cleverly is that we can use this as a source of price variation to identify elasticities. I know it looks like we're shifting out the demand curve, but that's not one of these forbidden demand curve shifts that would be a problem from an endogeneity perspective, because that's not really driven by some change in latent demand. That's just driven by the fact that consumers have to pay a smaller fraction of the price. And so that change in price is sort of plausibly exogenous to the predicted probability of whether or not the negotiation is going to succeed is probably exogenous to any time varying changes in demand. And so I thought that was kind of clever and worth pointing out. And they have a huge amount of variation in prices, as you saw, coming from the policy. And so it really helps them identify the demand curves. Okay, so we're getting marginal costs. They have the pre-policy period, and they invert out marginal costs in the usual way, which is great. And so now they have both the demand curve without insurance, demand curve with insurance. They've got marginal costs. It's easy to get this minimum price for the negotiation straight from the producer surplus and the unconstrained market. The harder part is, how do we think about actually figuring out what the maximum price that could be negotiated is and what the actual price that ends up being realized is? And in particular, these are governed by these two parameters: beta, which is the government's weight on government spending, and tau, which is the bargaining parameter. And this is how they deal with this is kind of clever and worth taking a minute on. The usual challenge we face in estimating bargaining models is, how do we disentangle variation in marginal costs from the bargaining parameter? Here, they don't have that problem because they've just gotten the marginal costs from pre-bargaining. The challenge here is, how do you distinguish variation in prices that's coming from tau versus this stochastic preference that the government has over its expenditure? And the key insight that they have is that while both tau and beta are going to affect the negotiated prices if a negotiation succeeds, only beta is going to affect whether the negotiation actually succeeds. And so if they estimate a model of both whether the negotiation succeeds and what price occurs conditional on success, then they can separately identify the two. So once they have this estimated model, they can do a lot of cool things with it. And I highly recommend you read the paper, because there's a lot of things that they do, and we don't have time for that in the next 45 seconds. I will give one word of caution. If you read these and are expecting to be able to port the exact insights to the US setting, I would be a little bit careful, because some of the results really rely on the specific shape of the demand curve in their setting. So, for example, in a lot of cases, what they have is, if the government negotiates a lower price, it actually increases government expenditure because so many more people uptake using the drug. Whereas I think we would almost never think of that as being the case in the US, where if a pharmaceutical company negotiated lower prices, it would actually increase their expenditure. Okay, so in conclusion, I'll say this is a really important paper. It studies a really important setting that has a huge impact on billion or over a billion people. They have a really clear and compelling approach to modeling negotiation and formulary inclusion, and they have this really neat new novel way to take something, this breakdown in bargaining that most of us just ignore, and say, no, we're going to use that as a feature rather than a bug in order to help us identify what the government's preferences actually were. And I'll leave you with, as a last thought, I'll take off my IO economist hat and put on my health economist hat and say, if you told me there was this amazing reform that added like 1 million life years every year and gave 1.4 billion people access to new healthcare, I would not have said, I'm going to go write a bargaining paper. there's got to be, another QJE to be written about what is the impact here on health and on the families and on their lives and on their well-being. And so, congratulations, the authors. You have your AER. Maybe now go get your QJE.
But I see a bunch of hands. I'm going to take this side of the room. Alan can take the other side of the room.
Yeah, do you have any evidence that they actually started negotiating and then it failed? Because the way that failed negotiations, the phrase is used in some of the other parts of literature, is it refers to like a negotiation was happening and then it broke down. It started and then it failed. And in that case, in that kind of setting, it's hard to rationalize it as a complete information setting, because you wouldn't even start if you know that gains from trade don't exist. You wouldn't even start. So if you don't actually have any evidence that they started it, then you're fine, because then you can just go ahead and maybe change the name. Maybe you don't want to say failed negotiation, or you want to just clarify that this is not the same way it's used elsewhere in the literature. There's no actual breakdown of negotiating parties that had started going back and forth. You could instead, in that case, maybe just describe it as infeasible. And I notice Ashvin used this sometimes too. Said they didn't even come to the table. It was infeasible to even start with. And that might be a more precise way of describing what's happening rather than failed negotiation.
Yeah, this was fascinating. And I think also, Ashwin, to remind us to not necessarily extrapolate this to the US, because it's a paper about kind of innovative drug. And then you didn't really want to talk about innovation. And I understand why. But then I wonder, if you were to take a toy model and you calibrate it with kind of R&D cost, or Rebecca Dick's geometry paper kind of responses to R&D to drop in profit or expected profit, without the expansion, I think negotiation actually lower profits quite a bit. And are we worried, or how worried are you that you would see less entry, and how many lives would then we lose because of lower entry? I mean, it's a natural question that I think engaging a bit about that would be very helpful.
Great paper. I would encourage you to put in some more about competition between these drugs and whether they're substitutes or not. When Mark Duggan and I studied the rollout of Medicare Part D, the private firms that offer that coverage, we could show that there was a substantial difference in the price discount available depending on how many substitutes there were for the drugs in question. And that doesn't show up explicitly, at least in what you told us. In principle, it's there because the government's objective function has consumer surplus in it, and consumer surplus would, of course, depend on whether, if I have a disease, there is any treatment for it or not. I'm not sure that, so I have a question embedded in my comment, which is, I don't think you're doing that, because when you put in this life expectancy, you get a different result. And if you really had the full effect of consumer surplus, adding life expectancy wouldn't do anything to the answer. It would already be embedded in consumer surplus. So I think you don't have it. So that would be extremely interesting to include, because then you'd get all the nice competitive effects that we usually study.
I was wondering why the government decided to, I found over here, I'm behind you. Hi. Hi. I was wondering why they decided to, since it's a unitary purchaser, why they decided to use linear prices and not something more efficient like a subscription model. And the other question is, it seems like the option to exclude is just increases the power of the government. Like the firm doesn't have the ability to commit to excluding itself from the market. So I wonder if that would affect I mean, it's just a detail, but how that would affect the estimates.
Thanks so much for the paper. I had some questions floating around my head about potential for strategic dynamics. I guess both the firms and the government might have in mind that there's this increasing set of drugs that have negotiated prices over time. And so there's consequences for being failing a negotiation today in terms of disagreement payoffs next year are going to be different. And so just wondering about how much harm doing static negotiation might do here.
I was wondering about the marginal costs that you backed out in the first part, because I guess I was surprised given, and this is related to Ashwin's last point, given how much expansion there was, you would have, it's hard for me to think about how the prices they were charging initially were optimal, given that, like, it seems like I shouldn't need the government to start this program. I should kind of go up and say, here's the price I'm going to charge you. I mean, if there's not leakage out of China or whatever, here's the price I'm going to charge you. Like, why don't you cover it? Like, it's just kind of interesting to me that I kind of need to see all the steps to understand why they were charging such a high price beforehand. And I feel like it must be you're backing out a big, that must mean you're backing out a big marginal cost in the first stage. And I think of, like, what is the plausibility of the marginal cost that you've backed out in the first stage based on what we know?
Based on building up on Judy's question here a little bit about the marginal cost, I'm wondering, since it's a very innovative drug, do they learn? So basically, is there an additional threat that they won't be getting an access to Chinese market, and it's just not the profit itself, but also the future decrease in the marginal cost because they're going to learn so much by being there and treating such a big population? I just don't know enough about this type of drug.
Yep. Hi, Hanley over here. I had a similar reaction as Brad. Like, if there's no gains from trade, the negotiations, it's a success actually. And then one that made me think of, like, you're putting the heterogeneity on the beta, which is like the government's source of cost of funds. Seems like that's the type of thing that wouldn't vary across drug, and you just equally reinterpret it as some payoff shock. It could even be a bargaining parameter shock. So does it matter that you, like, where you put that? And then one more thought along these lines is, if you see a drug fail in 1 year, but then succeed another year, then it suggests it's not just like an efficient, no gains from trade outcome, that there's some other friction.
Yeah, I wanted to echo Alex's question again, and emphasize, I think the authors in another paper have shown that there are enormous innovation impacts of this policy. As you might expect, when you increase the market size of a drug by 1 billion, you might expect some supply side responses. And so this could feed into really important dynamics in the bargaining problem, where there could be consequences of failing negotiation today for coverage tomorrow, et cetera. And I think it'd be interesting to think more about that.
I wonder if any other countries have MFNs that have their prices tied to China's prices. And I guess by extension, whether or not that's going to impact where they would have a two-part tariff, linear pricing, and so on.
Picking up on Brad and Ali's points, it seems like you could potentially exploit the fact that some failed negotiations subsequently result in a successful renegotiation to tell us something about where the asymmetric information actually is. Like, are these agents not understanding one another's disagreement payoffs? Are they not understanding the bargaining weights correctly, et cetera?
You can.
One or two things, and then.
Okay. Thank you. First of all, the demands includes all drugs, the entire cancer drugs set. So it has nasty logit, where the nest is indication, and it has, different drug attributes. So we do incorporate substitution. The fact is those innovative drugs have weak substitution across each other, usually because of different indications, different targets, and different mechanisms. And to the point of failed negotiation, I completely agree that there ought to be some kind, they are failed, meaning the negotiation started in the morning and failed after 1 day negotiation. That occurs 25% of the time. And so there ought to be some incompleteness, incomplete information. It's just that going down that route is a lot more complex than what we're trying to do. I think our focus is not so much about whether the information is complete or not, but rather what are the outcomes? What are the distribution implications? That's why we took the direction we did. And there was a healthcare paper. Tianli wrote the healthcare paper. I'm sure he will be glad to know it's a QGE level material. And, Petro's comment, indeed, we have a couple of follow-up projects on innovation. This is very important, how this stimulates innovation. Are there different policy levers that actually affect different innovation differentially? That's in the pipeline. The dynamics is not in the pipeline yet. I'm sure with enough capacity, some of you in the audience, I would love to, or maybe someone else can write a paper about dynamics. And the marginal cost, the reason is wealthy people, predominantly wealthy people were purchasing them before the reform because they were just so pricey. And the insurance expansion massively reduced out-of-pocket spending. So it is rationable. You can rationalize, the large expansion in our setting and high prices before the reform. And they do learn, that's something in the future. And I don't know about reference pricing yet. I would love to look into that.
Well done, Pamela. That was terrific. All right. Thanks for a great start, everybody. We have a break until 10:20, and then it's Richard Sweeney in the U.S. shale boom. Thanks. All right, everybody, come in and find your seats. Shh, 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 shh. This is the one energy paper on the program, so I guarantee you I'm not going to cut this one short. So we better get started because we're not going to go short on this one. All right, so Richard Sweeney is going to be presenting for us in our last session here on the U.S. shale boom.
Great. Thanks a lot for putting us on the program. This is joint work with Tom Covert, Conan Nara, and Ryan Kellogg, who's here. And the high-level overview of the paper is if you want to measure changes in the productivity of an industry over time, you need to account for the fact that the investment you observe might be differentially selected over time. And our setting is going to be the U.S. shale boom. Okay, it's hard to really do justice to kind of convey just what a big shock to U.S. oil and gas markets the fracking revolution is, but here's one figure. What I'm plotting here is monthly domestic crude oil production in the United States. And you can see we had a peak in the 1970s. This was when we sort of maxed out our production from conventional resources. And then there was just like this seemingly like inevitable downward decline. We're getting less and less oil out of our conventional resources. And then starting in the mid-2000s, this reversed. And pretty spectacularly, we had this massive increase in domestic oil and gas production due to fracking. And you can see not only are we now producing more oil than we ever had before, we're actually producing more oil and gas than any other country in the entire world. Okay, so I think people in this room are like, at least vaguely aware that the fracking revolution was a big deal. You might know that the United States is the biggest oil and gas producer in the world. But I think kind of conventional wisdom about this is that basically what happened was we kind of unlocked this technology, fracking, in the mid-2000s. And we just started like drilling everywhere, and this is just coming from us just putting more and more wells in the ground. But what I'm going to show you is that actually when you look at the data, the primary driver of that big increase in output since we started the shale boom is not coming from drilling more wells. It's that the wells that we're drilling now are getting much, much more oil and gas out of the ground than at the start of the shale boom. So you can see this is just like the raw averages nationally. You can see our gas and oil wells are producing like 4 or 5 times more output per well. So, basically what we're going to try to do in this paper is try to unpack that massive increase in output per well. And in particular, we're going to try to decompose those changes into changes that are driven by site selection and changes that are due to firms' operational decisions. Why is this important? So by far, the biggest determinant of how much oil or gas you will get out of a shale well is how much oil and gas is in the ground that you're drilling into, right? So you could take you could take Exxon, one of the most productive oil companies in the world. If they sink a shale well outside the Sonesta, they're not going to produce very much. Conversely, you could take one of the least sophisticated oil and gas companies in the world, and if they drill a well in the Permian Basin in West Texas right now, it's going to generate millions of dollars worth of output. All right. And so when we look at a figure like that and we just see big increases in output per well, we're going to want to say what's happening to the locations that we're drilling in over time and try to control for site quality. And so what we're going to do in this paper is we're going to write down an econometric model of output per well, which is going to model when wells are drilled over time. And in this model, we're going to allow for two specific channels of selection. First of all, we're going to allow these sophisticated energy companies with big capital budgets and fancy geologists on staff, we're going to allow them to have better information than us about which locations are good and which locations are bad before any drilling has taken place. So they're going to have some signal about site quality before they drill. And this signal, if it's very precise, we have some theory, going back to hoteling that says if firms know exactly where the good and bad locations are, then they're actually going to pick the best locations first. So when we look at a figure like that, that actually could understate what we'd call productivity growth, because towards the end of the shale boom, we'd be drilling in worse locations if the hoteling story dominates. But we're also going to allow for the possibility that those geologist signals aren't perfect. And the second component of selection that we're going to model is firms' ability to learn. Okay, so now imagine firms have an idea about where the good locations are. They drill a well, they're going to get some oil and gas, and that's going to give them a signal about the underlying quality, and we're going to allow them to update their beliefs after drilling. And this ability to learn from drilling is going to lead to a force pushing in the opposite direction, which is maybe initially firms didn't know that much, but they have the ability to learn, and they could converge on the best locations over time, such that much of that big increase in output per well that we're seeing might not be what we'd call productivity. It could be just drilling on better locations. All right, so those are the two sort of channels of site selection that we're going to try to model. And then we're going to try to decompose that massive increase in output per well in those two channels. And then everything else we're going to lump into a category that I'm going to put in air quotes one time and call productivity. But this is going to be the sum of firms' operational decisions, both changes in inputs and how they use those inputs. I'll come back at the end of the talk and try to decompose that a little bit more. Now, this paper is obviously going to be very focused on the specific setting, but I do just want to pitch here that I think the ideas that we're using here to deal with site selection are applicable in other settings. And basically, the key ingredients you need are a setting where you have sequential investment and you observe investment level outcomes. Okay, lots of natural resource problems look like this: wind, solar, geothermal. Franchising or store expansion kind of looks like this. Which markets do you enter? When do you add a second or third store? Funding, which startups do you fund when? I think research and development ideas, like which ideas do you pursue when? They all kind of fit under this umbrella. Okay, tiny bit more about the background that we actually study, the empirical setting. We are going to estimate this model in two major shale plays in the United States. One is the Bakken, which is an oil play up in North Dakota, and the other is the Haynesville, which is a gas play down in Louisiana. In this talk, I'm only going to show you results from North Dakota. In the interest of time, parallel figures and tables in the paper. The qualitative story is similar across both plays. Now, why is this a good setting to study selection? Well, a key feature of this setting is that we are going to actually observe the universe of potential investment opportunities from which observed investment is selected. Why is that? Well, these parts of the country, this part of the country, land is actually divided up over 100 years ago into these administrative public land survey sections, which are these 1 square mile red blocks. And that actually defines the units that firms have to gain control over to drill to this day. Minerals on these lands are actually owned by private individuals, farmers, ranchers, et cetera. They own the parcels that are kind of these subdivisions that you see with the black lines underneath the red squares. But in order to monetize these assets that these individuals own, they have to partner with an oil and gas company. These partnerships take the form of a mineral lease, and they provide the option, but not the obligation, to drill within 3 to 5 years. We have data on the universe of leases that are signed, when they were signed, and who they signed them with. And then the other key feature that we have on in this data, there's going to be a question of sort of did we drill good or bad locations at different times? Surely we must know something in the literature about where places are good. We know outside the Sonesta is not good. And we're going to bring in information from the geology literature, which is this measure of original oil and gas in place. This is basically a geologist estimate for every one of these red squares. What is the hydrocarbon content per square foot? So that's going to be our observable measure of quality. From this universe of potential investment opportunities, we're going to observe actual investment. This is going to be data from Drilling Info, now NBER, and we're going to see every well that was drilled. We're going to see kind of where it went in the ground, that's the circles, and exactly the horizontal line string, the lateral, that's the lines. We're going to know when it was drilled and by who. And then we're also going to have very detailed information on exactly the quantity of output produced for every well by month. Okay, so that's the good part of our data. We have great info on where investment was and how much it produced. The key limitation of our data is we do not observe very detailed information about inputs at the investment level. We don't have labor, capital that went into it. And that's why on the first slide, I said what we're going to recover for now, I'm going to put in air quotes one last time, is going to be what I'm going to refer to loosely as productivity. It's stuff that firms are doing to increase output per well, conditional on site quality. We're going to end up with a sample in North Dakota of about 10,000 of those red squares, which are potential investment opportunities. 70% of those we actually see exercised by the end of 2019. So already right off the bat, it's kind of suggesting there might be some selection. Okay, so now turning to the model. This is our empirical model. The dependent variable is going to be the log output per unit length of a well that is drilled into some section I. A section is one of those red squares. And the first determinant of that we're going to try to seek to measure is this omega term, which is going to be our catch-all productivity term. And it is going to vary across time with the time t that section I was drilled. Okay, this is going to be the sum of things that firms can do to increase output per well, conditional on site quality. And so we're going to decompose site quality into observable and unobservable components. X is going to be our observable measure of site quality. This is original oil in place. And then the unobserved component is going to be further divided into these two terms to capture the two margins of selection that we're interested in measuring. Eta is going to be the component of site quality that is unknown to us as econometricians, but that is observed by the firm drilling before any drilling has taken place. All right, this is they have geologists on staff. This is their what they know about site quality in addition to original oil in place before drilling. And since they know this before drilling, this is going to generate selection potentially on the extensive margin on which squares get drilled. Okay, and so we're going to deal with that first when we look at kind of this extensive margin decision of the first well that's placed on a section. Theta is going to be this mean zero term that is something that firms don't know initially, but they will get a signal about once they start drilling. They'll update their beliefs. And the fact that, and if firms are able to learn, this is going to potentially generate selection on the intensive margin of a section. Okay, so you decide to drill a second well, a third well. On that picture I showed you a few slides ago, you can see that some of these sections have many, many wells on them. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about how we deal with selection for these two elements on these two margins in turn. To deal with selection on firms' ex-ante beliefs about site quality, we're going to construct an instrument based on leasing. Now, a key thing you need to know about leasing in this setting is that, first of all, you need a lease in order to be able to drill. But these leases are acquired in a very decentralized fashion by intermediaries. What do I mean by that? Let's say Exxon wants to drill in this area. They don't get out with their geologists and identify specific red squares and then go knock on that person's door. The way it actually works is they will identify kind of like a broad area of a shale basin, maybe a county or a town. And then they're going to hire a bunch of guys in cowboy hats to go out and knock on people's doors and get them to sign mineral leases. They'll come back with some, and those are the sets of options that Exxon's then going to decide if they want to exercise. Why does this matter? Well, when those guys, those landmen, go out and try to sign up leases on some of these parts, on some of these red squares, all right, clicker, oh, here, can you see here? There are going to be very few surface owners because the land has very few subdivisions on it that they're going to have to negotiate leases with. On some of these other parcels, on some of these other squares, there are going to be many landowners you're going to have to negotiate with. And previous research has documented that fragmentation of surface rights actually delays mineral exploitation. So that's the idea. What are we actually going to do operationally? We're going to construct an instrument ZI for every section as the date at which that section is 50% leased, residualized on a broader grid of 20 by 20 sections. The key kind of idea here for identification is that the variation in the underlying geologic quality, that is like we're trying to control for, is smooth, but the difficulty in leasing varies a lot from section to section. All right, so now we've got this instrument. How are we going to use it? We're going to construct a control function. So kind of to fix ideas, what would we do if we were just worried about selection on the extensive margin? We might do something like a Heckman correction. Okay, so we would predict for every one of those sections what's the probability it's drilled as a function of all the stuff in our output equation X as well as our instrument Z. We would take those predicted probabilities and we'd include them flexibly in our output equation to deal with selection on eta. In this paper, we're not just interested in whether or not something was drilled, but when. And so we've got this more continuous measure we want to, continuous endogenous variable we want to deal with. And so we're going to construct an analogous measure using a hazard function, right? So what are we going to do? For every section, we are going to estimate a hazard model which says conditional on surviving to time t, what's the probability you survive another period as a function of your x and your z? Then we're going to go back to our sections and we're going to, for each section, integrate up that hazard across time from the start of the shale boom to the time it was actually drilled to get an estimate of at the time you actually drilled, what was the probability you should have for each section. We put that flexibly in our output equation, and this is really borrowing ideas from Imbens and Newey, and we've got the kind of identification conditions in the paper. Okay, now finally show you some results. First, when we look at, when we estimate this model for first wells only, we estimate that the control function, the control function we estimate is consistent with positive selection. So how can you see that? On the x-axis here, we have for every section that was actually drilled, what was the predicted probability it should have been drilled when it was? And on the left-hand side of this figure, if a section was drilled way earlier than we think it should have been, that is going to be associated with 40 log points more output than if something that was drilled way later. Okay, so this is consistent with the hoteling story. Firms know stuff we don't, and they drill the good stuff first. Given that we have this positive selection early on, when we estimate omega for our first wells with and without the selection correction, when we control for selection, we are finding that productivity actually increased more than we would have thought. That's because the stuff we're drilling later in the sample is just got less oil and gas in the ground than the stuff we were drilling early on. Okay, so that's nice, but you might be looking at this and thinking, you know, this is also quite noisy on the right there for our model with the selection correction. And so what's going on there is that by 2013, 2014, we just do not have that much action on the extensive margin here. There are very, very few first wells anymore. There's still a lot of drilling, but this is coming from firms that are putting like a second and third well on a given location. And in order to deal with potential selection for those wells, we're going to have to model learning. First, let me show you some evidence that learning is happening. So on the x-axis here, this is the sort of unexpected output or the output shock for the first well in a section. So this is the amount of output you got relative to expectation for the first well. And on the y-axis, we have for that section, what's the probability you get a second well? And you can see if the first well was unexpectedly awesome, you are much more likely to drill a second well, consistent with learning. But importantly, it's also very clear in the data that learning is not perfect because part of the shock is signal about theta, the thing you want to learn about, but part of it is also the epsilon. There's just noise well to well. And you can see that here. So the x-axis in this figure is the same as the residual or the output shock from the first well. And then on the y-axis, we have the output shock for the second well. And this is just clear evidence of mean reversion. Part of what made the first well Awesome. Could have just been a high epsilon draw. And in expectation, that's lower if you take another draw. Okay, why does this matter? We talk about this a lot in the paper. I wish I could go into it more, but I don't have time. This is going to actually invalidate a much, much simpler estimation strategy that is commonly used in the literature to deal with spatial unobservables, which would be to include fine spatial fixed effects. So let's say you just wanted to try to learn about productivity growth within sections. So you have section fixed effects in there. This mean reversion is going to tell us that you're going to underestimate productivity growth because of the mean reversion in the errors over time. Okay, so what are we going to do? Have to do something a little bit more complicated. We're actually just going to model firms' learning processes, Bayesian learning. So basically, after the first well is drilled, we're going to allow the firm to update its beliefs about theta based on that first well's output. So we're going to define the output surprise of the first well as E1, which is just the output shock. And then we're going to be able to compute the expectation of the second well, given we got that shock. It's going to contain a different omega from the fact that the second well is drilled later, so productivity could have changed. The observable component of site quality and the unobserved component that they knew initially, eta, those are unchanged. We have to add in this second term, a little bit reminiscent of kind of the congestion discussion yesterday, to account for the fact that as you put more wells in a section, there's just kind of like less oil and gas in the ground for you to extract. So this is going to be a depletion term. But on this slide, I'm really focused with the last term that is potentially generating selection, which is how does our expectation of theta change? And what we can show is that if the first well's shock was positive, you are going to have a strictly positive expectation for theta. And I just showed you, you will be more likely to drill a second well. And so this is the selection we're going to try to deal with. Dealing with selection here is actually a bit more straightforward. It amounts to second control. So what I'm putting up here now is our kind of full model, allowing for ex-ante information and learning. So if we model the jth well placed on section I, it's going to contain omega, observable site quality, unobserved site quality you knew initially, depletion, and then this correction term here, which is going to be a function of the average shock you got on the J-1 previous wells drilled in that section. And then we've got this Bayesian learning term here. Kappa is the key parameter of interest. And this is basically telling us, this is basically a function of the variance of theta relative to the variance of the epsilon. So like how informative is learning? All right, can finally get to, after doing all this work, this model is going to allow us to, I think, plot some pretty cool decompositions of how site quality changed over time during the shale boom. So first, all I'm plotting is how the observable dimension of quality changed, original oil in place. And you can see there was this period around 2010 where observable quality dipped by about 10 log points before recovering in 2015. Once we add in how eta changed, this was the component of site quality that firms knew before drilling, but we don't. And we can see that this drops by about 10 log points as well from the start of the shale boom till 2012 and basically stays there. Okay, this is the hoteling story. The firms drilled the best stuff first based on their private information. Once we add in learning, that's going to provide selection correction going in the opposite direction in the latter part of the sample. So 2014, 2015, firms have drilled first wells in all the sections they will ever drill, but they decide to focus subsequent drilling after that on sections that they learned were better than they thought. Now, on this figure, we're constructing our learning correction just using the output shock from wells previously drilled on section I. But then in the paper, we extend the model to allow firms to learn from nearby sections as well. And so when we do that, we find that the selection correction or the positive selection over time due to learning is much, much bigger, like 40 log points at the end of the sample compared to the start of the shale boom. All right, so this is, I think, all cool. We have economically meaningful selection over time consistent with some theory. But returning to my initial motivation here, what does this mean for our estimate of productivity change? The punchline is that even after we control for a site selection, firms just had a massive increase in output per well over time, conditional on quality. Okay, so in this figure, the black line, I've lumped together all the margins of site quality into one figure. And the green line here is the sum of firms' operational choices. And you can see this is over 0.75 log points higher at the end of the sample compared to now. All right. So what does this mean for, what do we think is going on with this productivity growth? One thing that I'm sure you're thinking, Ariel's here, previous industries, people have shown in IO that a big source or a big driver of aggregate productivity growth is just reallocation to more productive firms, all right? We try to test that kind of simply by just putting firm fixed effects into our model. And the punchline from this is that has almost no impact on our estimated change in theta, in omega. And so whatever's going on here, it is something about improvements in operations or inputs or whatever within firm, not reallocation to more productive firms. Okay, my last minute or so, we'll talk about something we talk about a bunch more at length in the paper, which is what can we say about omega, all right? This is a catch-all term. It is going to change. It's going to include both changes in inputs as well as how productively firms, combine those inputs. And we can't estimate a sort of traditional production function, estimate marginal factor productivities, and isolate TFP just because we do not have good input data at the investment level. The limited inputs we see are sand and water for a subset of wells. And when we look at that data, those go up a lot over time. And in fact, they go up the most when we see omega go up the most. One thing we explore in the paper is it just the case that sand and water became cheap and people started using more of it? And we convince ourselves that that does not seem to be the case given observable data on prices. And so as we discussed, this is consistent with a couple different theories about what might be going on. One is firms actually were just learning about the production function. They didn't initially know how important it was to use more inputs like sand and water. This was Tom's job market paper. It's also consistent with them adding some unobserved input or technology that is complementary with sand and water, but is also boosting output that we don't observe. And then finally, it would also be consistent with like true productivity gains. So them figuring out how to combine these outputs more productively. Okay, perfect. So that's pretty much what I have. And to wrap up, in this paper, we introduce an econometric model that's going to account for dynamic selection into observed investment based on unobserved quality and the possibility that firms are able to learn. The first result is that there was meaningful selection differentially over time during the shale boom, where quality was positively selected on first wells and then positively selected later in the sample once firms learned. But even accounting for that, even if we condition on quality, we're estimating massive increases in output per well growth during the shale boom on the order of 8 log points per year. It's not driven by compositional changes, reallocating to more productive firms. It is associated with more inputs. We don't think it's due to prices. It's consistent with a couple, I think, important and plausible stories about improvements in firm efficiency. And let me just wrap up with a broader point here about what this means for the industry. I think the takeaway here is that the shale boom might be a lot more persistent than you would have thought in a sort of classic non-renewable resource model, because here, even though the quality could be declining or limited, firms are able to just get more and more output over time due to this increase in productivity. Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rich. Our discussant is Linear Bankard.
Okay, so thanks for inviting me, and thanks, Rich, for a great presentation. Okay, so we're looking at the U.S. shale boom. Oil and gas production increased by roughly a factor of 4. There's a couple of graphs here in the paper that on the left side. So why did this happen? So one, there's more wells. On the left side, the graph there is the output per well, which you can see roughly went up roughly 4-fold over this period. So output per well is going up massively. And then furthermore, so why is that? two reasons. One, the wells are actually getting bigger. So they're roughly doubling in size laterally over this period. And then the second reason is that the output per foot, so per unit size, also doubled. So that's the right chart there. And so what this paper is asking is like, okay, this seems like productivity went way up. Okay. So on its surface, it seems like productivity went way up. We're going to narrow in on the right graph only, actually only look at output per foot and ignore all the other parts and say, okay, that's our measure loosely of productivity. Is this actually productivity or is it something else? Like, for example, the learning story, maybe they just found better sites over time. They learned which sites were better. And this isn't actually productivity, but it's just drilling better sites. Or alternatively, actually, maybe this is an underestimate of productivity because we drilled the best sites first. And in reality, if everything else had stayed the same, it would have gone down, but it didn't go down, it went up. So actually productivity went up by even more. So basic idea of the paper is let's correct for all these things and try and figure out what really happened to productivity. Okay, so we're trying to break down productivity, output per lateral foot into several things, something that's I call quasi TFP because we don't really have all of the inputs that you might want. There's selection, also depletion. If you drill more wells next to each other, they get a little bit less oil because some of the oil's already been removed. One thing I wanted to highlight, which is sort of interesting when you think about this problem, this is not like a standard production function, as far as I understand. This is not my industry, but from reading this, in the sense of like, you don't put in more inputs and get out more output. The inputs are put in investing in a well, which is like which is a piece of capital, and then the oil flows. So you can put in more inputs and get a better well, but then you're just buying like it's a bigger investment, basically. The actual production doesn't involve much in terms of inputs, as far as I understand. So it's a little bit different. So when they say more inputs, it's actually a different kind of input. It's inputs into investment. Okay. So what do they find? There's selection of both types, actually. They do drill the best places first. There is also learning, substantial learning. There's also depletion. After controlling for all these things, it looks like there was a really big increase in productivity, or this operational productivity, they call it. And if you look, this actually is within firms. It's not like in many other settings we've seen in IO in the past. It's not reallocating from like old unproductive firms to new productive firms or something like that. It's the existing firms getting better. Okay. I should mention all of this is done like with a really nice econometric model using control functions, all frontier level, really nicely explained in the paper. I'm not going to get into the details of the econometrics. I don't want to put you to sleep before lunch, even though it interests me, and it's all really nicely done. I don't actually have a lot of comments on that part. So I'm going to make a couple of comments, four basic comments. The first one, I really like the approach of the paper. So it's a great topic. The paper is just really nice to read. It's exceptionally clear. The econometrics are well thought out. They're really well explained. And it's unusually honest about like the strengths and weaknesses of the data. It's just really nice as a discussion. I didn't have to work hard. I didn't feel like I was being misled in any way. It's very clear, really nice. I want to make a broader point. I really like the approach of the paper. In IO, there's a lot of literature. We rely a lot in estimating productivity. We rely a lot on aggregated plant level data on outputs and inputs, maybe across a multi-product firm. We're not quite sure what the output is or what the inputs are. They're often badly measured, subject to vague accounting conventions, reported in ways that are not designed to help economists learn marginal and fixed costs, but designed to exploit tax rules and other things. This paper does something different. It has a very narrow industry. Output is very clear. It's barrels of oil. And outputs and inputs, are very well measured. You saw the graph of the oil wells. They know exactly geographically where every oil well is, et cetera. So I really like that approach. It's reminiscent to me. Maybe this is why I was chosen to be the discussant. It's reminiscent to me of the work on learning by doing, where similarly you have a narrowly defined product. with outputs and inputs measured really well, and you're trying to figure out where the productivity comes from. Note that there are still difficult data and identification challenges here. For example, the selection problems. These problems are obscured in the aggregate data, but not eliminated. I just want to point that out. Like, in other words, you could run a production function here. It's not that selection on oil wells wouldn't exist. It'd still be there. You just might not know it was there, right? So it's really, this narrow approach allows you to see that. And I think there's a place for both types of papers, and I really like seeing this paper. So that's my first comment. This is kind of like the low-hanging fruit for discussing. I want to talk a little bit about the identification strategy. Hopefully it's not unfair, because they do a really nice job discussing it in the paper. So the identification strategies, after controlling for fixed effects on a fine spatial grid, residualized lease time is exogenous. So in other words, you can't drill until you sign a lease. And the idea is that after we control for geography, when the lease was signed is treated as exogenous. And then, so that's used as an instrument for when you drill. Okay, if geology varies smoothly, but property ownership does not, then residualized lease timing could be mostly determined by property ownership, and that's what they're hoping for. It's clearly violated on some level. It's important to the paper, so I feel like it's something that should be talked about. Why is it violated? Because demand still enters into lease timing. It's not just the ownership. There's measurable selection in drilling with respect to observable quality. So if you look at, it is true that observably better sites are drilled earlier. So that must mean that they're leased earlier. And the paper also estimates positive selection on unobserved quality conditional on leasing. So there is selection going on. And so the instrument's not perfect. Okay. So what could be done? I thought of two possibilities. I just think this should be further explored. There's room to further explore this. So one is owner fragmentation plus a theory of bargaining of some kind. There is this previous work showing that these areas that have these areas, there's some areas that have a lot of owners and others that have fewer. I don't actually know which one is easier to lease, but the past work suggests that the regions with a lot of owners are harder to sign leases with. That might be the case. Regardless, it seems like you could do something with that. I think there might be something also with geography, like are firms tending to lease near their existing wells? Is it cheaper to drill near existing wells? Is it cheaper to drill or ship oil out from some parcels than others? Like, are some hard to get to? That sort of thing. It's not for the paper. I just feel like there's room to explore that further. I also wanted to take a moment to talk about, what happened to, okay, to explore the interpretation results, because it's not TFP, and the paper is very clear about that. It's the increase in output per lateral foot remaining after you control for site selection. Okay, so what could this be? Rich did a great job talking about, input use did go up over time. The paper shows that so some further evidence, well costs have been flat over time. So it doesn't really seem like it's coming from inputs. It could be something else. And it got me to thinking about, is there a way to estimate something closer to TFP? And so, and this is kind of inspired by this graph here, which has the sections and the way they've drilled them. What you can see is basically there's oil under these sections, but they've drilled them differently. So some of them have a lot of wells right next to each other. Some of them have wells further spaced apart, et cetera. And it strikes me that what you're really looking at is there's a bunch of oil under a section, and the production function is about getting that oil out at the lowest cost. And you could do that a lot of different ways. So for example, you could put in many short wells. You could put in some small wells close together, or some larger wells farther apart. And I thought it might be useful to look at that from a production function point of view. So in this production function, you would have on the left-hand side the section as the unit of observation, so the amount of oil produced in a section over time. And on the right-hand side would be the number of wells, the lateral length. They even have the spacing of the wells, so stuff like that would say something about the production function that's about removing oil from this section. And then you have other stuff like geologic quality, observed inputs, et cetera. It just seems like this might get you something closer to TFP. So that's just a speculative idea, I called it. And then I just wanted to wrap up with one last comment, which is right now they have all this detailed data on geography, but they're really not actually using it. They're using like the section medians to control for distance and things like that. And I just feel like, especially today with all the LLMs and everything, it'd actually be reasonably easy to do the learning and the depletion using more information about the spatial geography. And I think that that would be useful. I think that's a straightforward extension that would just make it better, make everything better. So bottom line, it's a super nice paper. I really like the style that it does, and it's just really clear. The econometrics is nice. I learned a lot, and thanks again. Yeah.
Thanks very much. I see I'm going to start over on this side, or Camilla can start over on that side with some questions.
Thanks. Really cool paper. I like thinking really carefully about dividing these things up. I have sort of a big picture question and a narrow question. The big picture is, so what, right? Like, does this change how we think about how we should design policy with externalities? Does this change how we think about like Pennsylvania shutting down the potential for fracking, or New York doing it with better or worse wells? Like, can you tell us what this implies for policy? And then the second is sort of related to one of Lanier's late comments. If there's heterogeneity in learning, like what if you know more about how this will work in some places than others? Does that change your choice of the initial selection in a dynamic sense in some way that might lead to problems?
Yeah, I think my comments may be related to that. I was thinking, have you thought about allowing the selection equations to depend on sort of prior uncertainty across leases, right? If firms are drilling in order to learn, especially for the first well, and how might that affect your findings?
So you've modeled the technology, the productivity change in this kind of very neutral over time way. And it seems like the productivity change could either raise or lower the return to like learning and site selection, right? So, and also potentially depletion, right? So I don't know anything about this technology, but one theory I would have is that like the new, as we get better at it, we can sink a well at the Sonesta and get the oil from Appalachia, right? That's, that's like a statement about depletion, right? That like somehow you're being more productive about just sucking it from farther, or, I think just like you must know kind of something about what the source of the productivity gain is, which might inform which set of kind of interactions it would make sense to kind of drill down on.
Like Judy, I don't really know anything about the science here aside from having watched maybe an episode of the TV show Landman, but uh, so how much does the kind of vertical geology matter here? Like I would have assumed that there's probably some ordering in which you want to like either go top to bottom or bottom to top in general in a region. And if that's the case, like let's say hypothetically, you always started at the top and then over time you drill deeper and deeper. If it just happens to be that there's more oil in the deeper areas, is that going to look like increasing productivity over time as in general wells are deeper, or is that somehow addressed and I missed it?
Yeah. I've got Ariel, Rob, and then back here.
I just have two questions. One, unless I missed it in your 2000, when you look at your graph, you start not understanding the increase at 2016. And the question is, what happened around 2016? And then one other question, which follows on Lanier's comment. One thing you didn't tell us is the ones that are side by side, are they by the same firm? So could we do Lanier's analysis by just looking at where a firm does and when it does one big one and when it does three small? I think it's sort of interesting.
Jeremy next.
Yeah, I just wonder if there was some kind of safety issue or something going on in the early period, or some sort of environmental concern that they had, and they said, well, later on that we could really get more out of this, and then maybe these safety issues aren't such a big deal. We were more willing to put more in and, be a little edgier or something, and that's what some of this productivity gain is coming from.
I got preempted a bit by Ariel and Charles, but your selection equation's a bit spare in the sense of, at least the way it was presented, it's mostly focused on the fragmentation of the land ownership. But there are clearly other things going on that determine both the timing of the lease signing and whether or not you drill. And you said there's like 70% of the leases that aren't drilled. On the latter one, as Ariel said, fragmentation of ownership of the leases themselves may well matter. And then the other thing that you didn't talk about at all, maybe it's in the paper, and if so, I apologize. I mean, I'm surprised you're not conditioning on the price of oil, gas, and something about futures prices. I mean, you might even want to throw in a fixed effect, but that, of course, also picking up productivity changes, but that may well determine timing of things as well. And so then you could maybe just unpack a time fixed effect is, how much of that's due to prices and how much of it's some residual. But I do think you want to enrich that equation a bit.
I really enjoyed the paper. Even though it's not production function estimation, it shares the flavor of TFP as a measure of our ignorance. And I'd love to know what's really going on in terms of input change on industry scale, industry input costs. You told me that there's not much of a reallocation between firms from less productive to more productive firms, which suggests maybe there's something that's industry-wide change in the kind of inputs and the amount of inputs that got used. And I'm sure there must be some good documentation of that on industry-wide scale, which would allow you to bound what likely happened on input side and even like upstream industries.
So I'm going to use the organizer prerogative again to ask a question. Having looked at reserve data for a long time, I'm no longer worried about the world running out of oil for good or bad reasons. But it strikes me that this whole discussion about are we depleting oil reserves, how quickly, what are the reserves, gets much more complicated when you get into these selection effects and also this learning from one site onto another site. And I've always been mystified on the measurement of reserves because they depend on the cost of oil and all this. And it just seems that you have something that can get to a discussion of how quickly are we going to, if we did measurement of depletion correctly, how quickly would we run out? Should we worry about North Dakota not producing anymore or not? And do that in an economically richer way than what's been done.
All right, I'm going to give you the mic, but first, is there refracking in your area? Because that seems like a measure literally of how much more oil could I get out of this well if I had this year's techniques rather than the techniques that I was using whenever I first fracked it.
Sure. Okay, I'll defer refrac and Ryan. On this point about reserves, I mean, what you said is exactly right. And, this is a gripe I've long had. We have these measures that are widely reported is like, this is how much oil or gas is available. And this is counting up the quantities that are available at like, they're economically viable. But then if we get more productive, the reserves just grow, even though it's not like we got more oil and gas in the ground. And so, the implication for that is kind of coming back to Ashley's comment about like, I don't have necessarily a strong policy implication, but if I put on my other hat, which is an environmental economist, I'd say it's like not great. It's just, there's a lot of oil that we are going to be able to extract for not very much money. Good for consumers, not great for the planet. I will maybe, one thing I want to do, there were a couple of comments about the timing and about price. And can I switch? Perfect. All right. Okay. This is the last slide I cut. And this was actually a big emphasis of the paper earlier. Okay, so what I've got on the top is the oil price, huge volatility over time. And we see it was really high when fracking started. It's part of why it started when it did. Crashes with the Great Recession then recovers, and then we have another crash around 2014, 2015. Okay, the red line is wells spudded in North Dakota. When the second crash happens, people pull back on drilling a ton. The bottom line is production per well. And you can see exactly when prices crash, we get a lot more output per well. And the original pitch for this paper, some of you have seen it earlier in other versions, was that like this is described like in the Wall Street Journal as when prices are low, firms like figure out how to become more productive, okay? And of course, what is happening is like the quality of well you will drill when the price is 120 is a lot worse than when it's 40, okay? And so the timing here, this is the original selection we were trying to account for. And one thing we removed from the paper but we had, if you saw me present it in the spring, it's interesting that when we account for selection, we are actually finding people emerge from basically enter this environment and productivity seems to grow there. And we were really initially trying to like drill down on sort of when omega increased, and is there something here about slack time? So like you're not drilling many wells, your engineers are just sitting around and maybe they're figuring out how to become more productive. I think we still have that site in the paper, but there's a management literature on that. We kind of shied away from it because we just have like these two plays and we didn't want to lean into it, but that's sort of my best guess to your question. Ryan, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I'll sort of knock out a couple of these and apologize because I don't know if we're going to get to quite everybody's comment. So maybe start with Megan, go reverse order on refracking. Yes, refracking happens. I can't quantify how often that shows up for you in our data. We're pretty confident that with the wells we have, we're measuring like first 3 years of production, which is kind of before you'd go in and refrac. So refracs are not part of what we've been showing here, but they're definitely happening. They're going back into wells that they drilled in 2010 and fracked then with the 2010 technology and going back, hey, let's do this again and get more out of these things. Yeah, I guess on the technologies, this is the question sort of about are we getting deeper and deeper? You should think about this more as sort of like horizontal rather than depth. So like the rock you're going through on the way down, and these wells in North Dakota are about you're going down 10,000 feet and then you're going horizontally 10,000 feet. Like the technology is bonkers when you think about it. The vertical part, like the challenge there is like literally just how hard is it to get through the rock? You're not producing any hydrocarbons out of that. So in terms of the output we're showing, it doesn't really matter. It maybe affects what the cost is to get there and how long it takes you to get there, but not the output that you're getting out of the ground. Rob, on prices, and I think this gets to some of the more broadly, like what's happening in the control function and how we set up this hazard. There is a flexible function of time in there, which we think of as doing like the catch-all of output prices, input prices, productivity is actually moving around all these things. So that's what that is doing there. Yeah, Judy, you asked about interactions. I think that's something we just need to do more of. And so I think some of that is easy, but does the increase in quote productivity over time, does it depend on whether you have a good X or a bad X? How does that interact with depletion? We have to think more about how we might econometrically think about, would we be able to interact that with like the learning and the unobservable selection? That's harder to do, but we could probably think about it.
Great. Yeah, the only other thing I guess I'll add, I should have said earlier on Jeremy's comment, it was definitely not the case that we were excessively safe in the early years of the shale boom. So I'd say if anything else, that's working in the opposite direction.
Yeah, no, maybe one more thing. With all the comments, forgot about Lanier. Thank you. This was great. Please send us the slides. That was excellent. Yeah, on the instrument, yeah, we've done some work. We clearly need to do more on that. Like we have parcel fragmentation maps that just come straight from the state of North Dakota. And we've sort of looked at the relationship between fragmentation and how long it takes to get drilling going on. Things point in the right direction. It's just way underpowered relative to what we would need to actually execute this in a way that's credible, precise, all the usual things, which is sort of why we sort of pulled back on using this leasing timing measure, which clearly there's, as with all instruments, there's the power versus is this really exogenous trade-off, and we should crank harder on that.
Thank you. Thanks. So just so one logistics. So the rest of the day is joined with digitization. So the next paper is at 11:40 on the other side, then lunch over there, and then 2 more papers after lunch. I'll do the closing remarks here before we get the digitizations guys kind of disturbing me. So first, thanks for NBER for hosting us. Thanks everyone for coming, engaging, behaving. Thanks presenters for exposing themselves to all these comments and responding pretty efficiently. Thanks the discussants for all the work. Thanks Keilali over there in the corner. Round of applause for and thanks Ben, Camilo, Alan, and Megan for picking the right papers and sort of running it so smoothly. So thanks a lot for all the work. Just a quick, I think people mostly know this, but we have the winter meeting is lined up. I think it's February 5 and 6 in Stanford. Nano and Charlie and Bob Town are running it. I guess we'll send as usual call for papers in after Labor Day, and people should submit as many as possible. We have the production for the mini conference thing in the fall, in December 5th on here in Cambridge on production function, IO related stuff. The call for paper we sent in a while ago, we'll send a reminder. I think the deadline is mid-September. So anyone who is working kind of around this stuff, please think of like submitting. These are kind of fun conferences. And we'll do this much later in the year, but sort of, we haven't lined up more mini conferences for future years, but if people have, again, I'll send something more formal at some point in the next academic year, but people are, feel free to jump the gun and kind of shoot me emails with ideas. I mean, it's never too early to come up with ideas that were like some small topic within the umbrella of IO that have like a lot of exciting kind of papers and people working on. AI is one I mean, again, there are multiple things, but we can just collect ideas and then we stagger them kind of down the road. That's it for me. As usual, comments, feedback, complaints, anything, Chinese food related or anything else, just shoot me an email, get me on Zoom, find me, I'm always happy to try to tell you why you're wrong or why kind of, we can do things better. But anyway, thanks everyone again.